Afternoon, everyone. I'm Jenny Phillip, Chief Strategy and Innovation Officer at the Greater Houston Partnership. Thank you for joining us today for our final in the webinar series on One Houston Together's racial equity webinars. And so thank you for those who have joined us from the beginning on September 1st and have made this a part of your lunch routine every Tuesday through September. Very much appreciate you all joining during that time, and also for those who have been catching up on the recordings as they get posted. And so for those of you who have been following and who haven't, we started the conversations with a foundational discussion on understanding racism, and then we dug a little deeper on specific issues related to education and health. And then looked at bringing that together in terms of what it means to develop equitable communities. And finally today, we wanted to make sure that we talked about the business community's role and responsibility in addressing racial equity. And so I'm delighted to have today's panelists and to get deeper into what can be done in terms of action. We have LaTanya Flix, founder and principal of CauseAdvance, Ingrid Robinson, who actually, for those of you who had seen earlier, Ewan Ukbong with Baker Hughes had to step out the last minute. So thank you, Ingrid, for being able to join us as our panelist. She's the president of the Houston Minority Supplier Development Council. Nicole, Zhao, senior consultant at Deloitte, who helped co-author their report on supporting your Black workforce now. And Bob Harvey, the president and CEO of the Greater Houston Partnership. But before we turn it over to the panelists, we wanted to have some opening remarks from Bobby Tudor, our chair of the Greater Houston Partnership this year. Bobby?
Thanks, Jenny. Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks very much, Jenny. And thanks to all of you for joining us today. Before we get started, I just wanted to take a few minutes to share what the partnership has been thinking and doing related to racial equity and justice. Over the past few months, we've held a series of listening sessions and discussions with business and community leaders. And from those conversations, we've distilled 4 key principles that will guide our work in this area. The first is to be persistent and intentional about what we're doing here. We must have an unwavering commitment to solving the issues associated with racial inequity in our community. We are crystal clear that this is a matter of critical importance and that the business community can and should play a leading role. The second principle is that we should be bold yet nimble, which is to say, we'd like to resist just incremental steps and favor larger transformational shifts. That being said, we can't allow ourselves to be paralyzed by the pursuit of the perfect. We need to acknowledge that we'll make mistakes and that we'll need to course correct. And the importance is to recognize that quickly and to do it. We're also very clear that we have to possess self-awareness and humility in this process. And what that means is we need to understand how others perceive the partnership, especially in the Black community. We're very proud of the business community's history in Houston, and it dates back to the Chamber of Commerce in the mid-19th century. But we also need to be aware that by many, in particular the Black community, we are viewed as sustaining the status quo and in fact getting in the way of change and putting into place institutions that prevent change and prevent access. So being aware of that and humble about it, we think is critical to ultimately getting to the right answers. And then finally, we just need to require accountability here so that we can establish objectives and develop related metrics so that we can assess the impact that we're making. And we need to consistently hold each other accountable in both our actions and our decisions. I think one thing that's really, really important to us at the partnership, and certainly to me as the chair, is that this needs to be not just about dialogue, but about action. One of the things we've heard in our listening sessions is from the Black community in particular is, look, we've heard this all before. We actually know what needs to be done. It's a matter of doing it. So we are committed to that at the partnership, committed to actions that make things better and lead to a more just and racially inclusive community in Houston, and in particular business community in Houston. So with that, I will pause and turn it. And at the end of the day, these three things you see on the screen are what we're after, which is to build a shared understanding of racism, to establish structural changes to the partnership. And what that means really is that everything we do at the Greater Houston Partnership, whether it's working on policy, working on access, working on funding, whatever it is, it needs to be seen through a lens of racial justice, everything we do. And so in that sense, we need to get our own house in order, which we feel like we are well on the way to doing. And then finally, we do need to develop programmatic and policy solutions, which is to say we need to turn the ideas into action. So with that, I will pause. I want to thank everyone else one more time for joining us, and I'll turn it over to Bob.
Great. Hey, thank you, Bobby. Thank you very much. We've got a great panel. We want to thank our panelists. We're going to pull them in now. And there's been a lot of thought that has gone into the partnership's efforts of late to try to make sure we kind of live up to the moment and the feedback we've gotten from the community. So we appreciate everyone being on this webinar today. And those of you, this may be your fourth in a series, and we appreciate all of you being part of this. We've got a great panel. I think, Jenny, you were going to take a moment and introduce the panel.
Sure. So LaTanya Flix with CauseAdvance, Ingrid Robinson with the Houston Minority Supplier Development Council, and also a part of the National Minority Supplier Development Council Network, and Nicole Zhao with Deloitte. Thank you all for joining us.
All right. Well, let's just jump right in. Thank you, Jenny. Now, all of us and all of you on the panel undoubtedly have been drawn into conversations about racial equity and racial justice, not just since George Floyd's killing on May 25th, before and after, but I'd like to ask you to share what your company or your organization has been doing to address racial equity, just kind of to lay the foundation. And I would ask you to talk in terms of two timeframes. What have you been doing for some perhaps lengthy period of time, but then more specifically, what have you been doing in your company and your organization since May 25th? I'd like to start with Nicole, if I could. Nicole, can I ask you what's Deloitte been up to?
Yes, absolutely. So at Deloitte, we have had a strong focus on inclusion and diversity for a while. We had a female CEO who recently just moved to the WNBA as the WNBA commissioner, and we have a female board chair. But of course, there's a lot to do with regards to inclusion and diversity at Deloitte. And leading up to the moment that we are in now, we have had URM, underrepresented minority sponsorship initiatives, and a focus on URM recruiting and recruiting for people of different genders, disability statuses, veteran statuses, etc. And since the murder of George Floyd on May 25th and just the global awakening on racial justice that has shaken corporations, we have actually formed a Black Action Council composed of a diversity of individuals across the organization and a network of over 50 members of the Black community at Deloitte to really understand what can be done both internally and within Deloitte's sphere of influence in the community to drive inclusion, equity, and diversity. And immediately after the murders of George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, Tony McDade, and so many others, Deloitte actually committed and pledged $5 million to various organizations and surveyed our employees on what organizations to fund. So we had a direct say in that allocation of funds, which I think is really critical for organizations right now to really listen to what their employees want from their organizations and help steer the direction of companies.
So it sounds, Nicole, like while there was a lot happening in what I refer to as the DEI space prior to May 25th, it sounds like there has been a change of emphasis, or there has been some notable change in your efforts since May 25th, reflecting this current environment, an inflection, if you will.
Absolutely. And I'm specifically involved in the diversity, equity, and inclusion consulting practice. So we actually provide consulting services to our clients, who include Fortune 500 clients and global companies and organizations. We have always been offering these services, particularly in the past 5 or so years. And of course, this year we've seen a great uptick in interest and demand, and which I think is great that unfortunately the tragic events had to happen, but that we're now at a stage where the conversation has taken a different scale and level of attention.
Thanks, Nicole. LaTanya, let me turn the same question to you. And again, maybe if you don't mind letting me frame it in terms of what had you been doing and had you been involved in, and then how has that changed over the last 4 months, let's say?
Yeah, thanks for the question, Bob. This has really been a lifelong commitment for me. I've been in the social sector about 20 years or more, and really working to advance equity and diversity and inclusion, and also influence how philanthropic resources are allocated for social change. And so this experience gave me this really broad background, right, in launching new initiatives in program design and management, strategy, social impact, and it gave me the cachet to bridge both corporate and nonprofit worlds. So I've been in the space a while, but what feels very new about this work is that organizations, companies, individuals, one, that there's a heightened interest and awareness because of the moment that we were in, to Nicole's point. Someone said recently that equity, he didn't say it recently, he said it a few years ago, it was Fred Blackwell, but he said equity is like the new coconut water, right? Everybody's talking about it, but we're not sure at this point. I say, do we put it with vodka? Is it a mixed drink? Do we drink it straight? Should it be in a smoothie? Like, what do we do with it, right? So people have been talking about equity for a few years now, but in this moment, people want to know what to do, how do they do it? So the work has changed, and that the focus of my practice is now on helping people operationalize. Some people use the word embed, but to really take the value of equity and put intentional action and behavior change around it across an enterprise and across an organization. So it's not this one-off effort, and it's no longer lip service, or it's no longer communicating that I value something, but I don't have a real strategy to make that happen. I think the other thing that is different is that people really are thinking about this as an organizational change process. And again, not that one-off moment or a diversity moment, right? The other part is that people are invested more and more interested in a learning journey, right? What does this mean to deeply learn and understand structural racism, the drivers of racism, to have a real race analysis, so that we can determine where we are, what we know, and what we can do moving forward. And I think the third part is also around implementation planning. So now we know what we don't know. We want to have a strategy, and then how do we implement? So the work has changed in that regard, and that we're helping people to learn more deeply and to really operationalize what has been held as a value or a public statement, and to really make it alive within an organization.
Thanks, LaTanya. I've been at the partnership for 8 years and in the business community for 40 years. And people ask me oftentimes, what's different about this? And I'd say, people are simply, they're looking much deeper in themselves and into the issue than I've ever seen them dig before. And they're framing it more broadly than I've ever seen them frame it before. And using a language, frankly, that we didn't use in prior conversations. I mean, it is striking to me. There's still opportunity to be cynical about the world's willingness to change, but I would say it does certainly feel different this time. Now, the question is what happens as a result. Ingrid, you've been around these issues, around the minority supplier issues narrowly, but broadly as well. How do you see kind of the past and the present in terms of how organizations and companies are responding? And you need to unmute.
I often forget to do that. So the council has been in this space for about 46 years, and we've always helped corporations and we were founded by corporations to help them identify minority businesses that they could do business with. And so we've been engaged in this effort for some time. I think what's different now is similar to what you said, Bob, in terms of the conversation, and looking at how the efforts that we do are longer term. Instead of finding smaller contracts, how do we focus minority businesses into what I call the core business of organizations? And I think also a new aspect for us has been to help advise our corporate partners on how to bridge what was typically a supply chain function to engage minority businesses into a organizational function as employee groups are looking to figure out how they can contribute in this space. So we've helped companies to look at developing programs where their minority employees or employee affinity groups can participate in the development of businesses. So where they have expertise in certain areas that they could provide mentoring, executive coaching to these businesses to help them be more successful within that corporate space. So we've been looking at some things from a supply chain standpoint, like terms and conditions to make it more favorable to minority businesses to turn around cash quicker. I think we've been looking at things like prime supplier engagement, that tier 1 supplier that they have large engagements with, to engage them in the process of utilizing minority businesses as part of their supply chain. So we've been approaching it from a couple different aspects. One, things that we could do long-term for the suppliers, and then things that they could incorporate into the culture of their organizations to have larger sections or cross sections of their organizations to participate and contribute into this space. So I think that, to me, that's been one of the biggest swings, because at the beginning of COVID, we started doing supplier rationalization, and many supplier diversity departments were trying to figure out how they would exist. And then post Mr. Floyd's death, it became more of how do we deeper engage? And so I think that it's helped companies to shift their idea of the role that they could play in economic development in these communities.
Thank you, Ingrid. Let me come back to you with another question, and we'll go around the panel, but I'll start with you, and it kind of builds on what we've been talking about. So we're clearly hearing businesses make pronouncements, bold, loud pronouncements.
Yes.
And we're asking ourselves, all right, how can we distinguish between those companies and businesses, frankly, that are maybe just making the statement, but not walking the walk, right? So
right.
What do you think, what are you seeing today? What are your marks that you use to distinguish a business that's really committed and taking meaningful steps from one that may not be as committed? What do you watch for? What do you see?
Well, we look at the actions in terms of where they're contributing those funds and what those funds are being used for. We want to see deeper action than a marketing campaign. And so where are you putting those dollars? Are you actually developing businesses? Are you investing in employee networks and allowing those employees to engage in the community and valuing that input and that community service that they're giving? And so we're actually putting together, our national organization has a campaign called In This Together. And in the ITT campaign, you've had companies to contribute money into 4 different areas. One is around building our business consortium fund, which allows working capital to be invested in minority businesses to help them through this time and to help them be able to obtain larger contracts by having financing available to them. So some are investing there. We have others that are investing in what we call our developmental program. So like the one that we have, Pathways to Excellence. How do we prepare companies to be able to do business with governmental agencies and major corporations? So they're putting money into the actual development where we have milestones to track the growth of those companies and the investment in those companies. So there's other areas similar to that they're doing in those communities that were subject to riots. We've put money into rebuilding those minority and those small businesses in those communities and helping them get back on their feet. So we're looking at where are those dollars going, and then holding them accountable and reporting out what they're doing. So in this Together campaign, for instance, we had, in order to contribute to that, your CEO had to sign off on a statement related to that giving and their commitment to making this a long-term arrangement. So it couldn't just be a contribution made by a department, but your CEO had to sign on it so that there could be some accountability for delivering on that. So we're looking at how do we maintain visibility, but long-term commitment by putting their feet to the fire and watching where that investment goes.
You know, thanks, Ingrid. And maybe this is dated. At one time, I thought companies thought they were doing all that they were expected to do just by meeting minority suppliers halfway, just kind of by opening the door. And that's not the tone of the conversation I hear today. It's more, how can we help you succeed? You know, what kind of, this term scaffolding has entered the equation. How can we help create the scaffolding that allows a Black entrepreneur, let's say, to build that business and be successful? It at least has a different tone. LaTanya, absolutely, what do you think distinguishes a company that's kind of checking the box, if you will, from one that is seriously engaged with being part of the solution?
Yeah, I think one is to first release perfectionism, that we will not get this right and that we don't have to be perfect in the pursuit of becoming an anti-racist company, but that it's really a commitment to confront racism wherever we find it, starting with ourselves first, right? I think there are companies that realize that leadership is an activity and not a position. So that means that anyone in the company can lead in this and that everyone should. I think there are also companies that don't situate or position this work as HR or talent or capital, human capital kind of responsibility only, but across a company, they're really embedding deeply a consideration of what it means to become an anti-racist organization and to reduce inequities. So they're using tools like a back map to say, what are the drivers of the inequity and how can we reduce those drivers to get to a more equitable result? So the same types of analysis that companies apply for other departments, they're using those same type of critical thinking skills and lens to address racial equity. I think there are also companies that realize that the burden of this work should not fall to BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, people of color, that this is everyone's work, but that people of color should not be tasked to lead on this work and be expected to advance it without company support or be expected to carry it, right? Everyone is involved in this. I think, Bob, too, there are companies that actually normalize conversations about race, right? So it's not the thing that only happens through a diversity program, through a Heritage Month celebration, or when there's an issue, but that we can have conversations about race frequently and often. There are corporate cultures that allow you to address a microaggression without feeling like you will be penalized in some other way in performance or pay or salary or your ability to move in the company because you spoke openly. There are also people that speak up that are not BIPOC, right? That use their voice, their privilege, and their position within organizations to address racism. And I think lastly is that companies that realize that this is not a linear process fare much better than those that do. There's sometimes such a rush to action without strategy and without learning and without putting the other guards in place that you need to do this well, that people think if we plug and play, we should have a solution at the end and we can tie this to a KPI and all will be well. And it's not a linear process. It's work that, as Bobby mentioned earlier, that you have to commit to for the long term, and recognition that this is a journey and that we'll iterate throughout the process. We might test something, it might not work, we'll come back and do it again. So you want to bring design principles, innovative thinking, process, all of that to the work of racial equity, just like they would in any other department or line of business across the company. So those are some things that come to mind quickly about companies that do this well.
Thanks, LaTanya. I think you were one of the voices that encouraged the partnership to start by listening, and that alone distinguished this effort from prior efforts. We typically didn't start by listening. Is it at all too late for people to start listening that may have jumped into a program, jumped into action without taking that step? Is there anything that keeps you from going back and picking that step up again at this point?
Absolutely not. Humility and honesty and the ability to say, we've made a statement, but we realize we know now what we don't know. And so we want to listen better. So we want to listen to employees outside of performance appraisal and outside of team meetings. We want to listen deeply, and we want to understand what it is like to experience this company from a BIPOC perspective. So they can listen that way. They can listen to communities, focus groups, anonymous surveys. There is always an opportunity to listen. And I would offer, if you've already advanced a statement, that you backtrack and listen and then go forward.
Thanks, LaTanya. Nicole, same question. I mean, how do you distinguish between the companies, the clients, the potential clients that are serious and those that may not be as committed to this endeavor?
Yeah, absolutely. I love what LaTanya was just talking about with the first step being listen. That's the first step that we've outlined in our Supporting the Black Workforce Now research paper, or research evidence piece. And the first step is listening. And the key is not to just get stuck in constantly listening and then not doing anything about it. To LaTanya's point, it's all about iteration. Technology has a design principle or design methodology called Agile, where they're operating things in sprints. What would it look like if organizations were tackling racial equity in a sprint-like fashion, where there's trying new things, trying things based on research and the expertise that has been put out there? It's, as you mentioned earlier, and as Bobby Tudor mentioned earlier, people know what to do at this point. It's just a matter of doing it and trying it and seeing what happens as a result. And if there are improvements to be made, stopping, reflecting, and making those improvements. And listening is a thread that has to be weaved throughout the process so that organizations can really put in place the changes that BIPOC employees can benefit from, and their BIPOC communities that they serve can also benefit from. I think one big difference between companies that seem to be performing or just paying lip service versus those that are truly committed to the work is putting the money, dollars, resources, support, and a listening ear to your DEI team members, and also those outside of DEI and BIPOC employees more generally, and the community that you serve, to really advance change. So a lot of the times organizations will put in place a chief diversity officer or a DEI team, have them report to an HR talent organization, but not give them the power and the structure and the resources to really drive the change that they need to see. There needs to be backing, both financially and from a leadership and employee buy-in perspective, to really move the needle on this topic.
Nicole, and to some extent, you're already speaking to my next question. I mean, we're building the racial justice and equity efforts on the foundation of longstanding DEI efforts in most companies. I mean, it's not like they're discovering DEI today, but yet we hadn't solved the problems we typically associate with DEI, like hiring practices, pay practices, promotion and advancement practices, representation and executive management. So almost stepping back to that older framework, but acknowledging that we're now in a different setting. I mean, how are you helping companies think about those DEI practices that they had hardly taken to completion at this moment? I mean, what effort should be going into those areas today, but in this context of racial justice and racial equity?
Absolutely. And I think that the conversation earlier at the start of this panel really highlighted the change in conversation. There's a different language now that's entered society's vernacular for talking about this. And specifically within organizational America and corporate America, there's a different vernacular for this. We're now talking about race, privilege. We're talking about equity. And I think that is the key word that people in organizations haven't focused on as much in the past few decades. They focused on diversity and inclusion, but that middle word, equity, to LaTanya's point earlier, it's something that people either didn't know to think about in terms of their business, or they didn't know how to operationalize. And I think now we're in a moment where people are really starting to grasp that that is distinct from diversity and inclusion, but necessary for diversity and inclusion to even be meaningful or substantial. You can't have real diversity and inclusion without that keyword equity. And by equity, I mean that depending on the type of group you are in and the barriers that these groups have systemically and historically faced, what resources, access, and outcomes are being fairly allocated to those groups depending on their needs. I think that historically organizations have focused a lot on equality, where people are given the same resources to succeed regardless of the background, and there's a focus on bringing a diversity of people in the door and making them feel included. But that doesn't mean anything if those people that are in the door are not being paid equitably for their work, understanding that there is a wage gap in between people of color and people who are white, and people who identify as men and people who don't identify as men. When you don't tackle the historic and systemic barriers that lead groups to be in different places on a structural level now, then you're not really getting at the root of the problem. You're just perpetuating the system, but making it look more diverse. And so I think that one way, for example, let's take promotion, of focusing equity in the conversation is promotion might think about diversity in terms of what does my leadership look like and what does my management look like? How diverse is it? Inclusion is saying, how welcome do they feel once they're in those roles? And equity says, okay, knowing that our idea as a society of executive presence and cultural fit are maybe biased and inequitably favor a specific group of people, what might it look like if we were to really inculcate an objective rubric of criteria so that everyone is judged along the same lines and along objective feedback, and ensure that multiple people review performance review decisions and compensation decisions so that there's mitigation of bias throughout. How do we look at equity from an organizational lens and a systems and structures lens in the same way that we're trying to look at it in society outside of the business? How do we bring that into the business to really look at it across the talent lifecycle? Because it's really a system of inequity. It's not hiring in silos or pay parity in silos or promotion. Each of these aspects influence the other, and it's important to take that systemic lens to equity. And I think that conversation has just started with corporate America.
No, Nicole, I think you're right. I'll personalize it a little bit. You know, this conversation about racial justice has made me uncomfortable, where prior conversations about DEI did not make me uncomfortable. I saw an opportunity to move forward as but this is the first time I've had to go back and look at the framework that has convinced me that I have succeeded by some combination of luck and merit, not by some systemic advantage. And yet now I'm starting to appreciate the systemic feature of this, which is just, to me, wasn't part of the earlier conversation, right? And the issue, as you say, about equity wasn't part of the earlier conversation. LaTanya, this is almost a softball for you, I think. Not to solve it, but to speak to it. I mean, just one element of this when it comes to hiring, promotion, advancement, everything, even dealing with vendors in the minority supplier setting, is implicit bias that has become kind of back into the forefront today. It was a discussion even in the DEI stages, but I think it's had more of an edge on it today. Talk a little bit about how implicit bias is something we have to factor into the current discussion and address in the current setting.
Yeah, thanks, Bob. So implicit or unconscious bias is the process where in our brain we receive I think it's like 11 million bits or pieces of information, but our brain can only process 40 of the 11 million that we receive in a second. So we then rely on attitudes, stereotypes, and past beliefs to make decisions. But it's a subconscious process. It's not one that we are aware of is even happening. Implicit bias, it's pervasive. People are often unaware, as I just mentioned, that it's happening, and that there are different levels of implicit bias for different people. So it's insidious, much like racism. It happens and you aren't even aware that it's going on. And so often the way implicit bias shows up in culture and in organizations is with in-group referrals. That's a good example. So that any hiring decision, procurement, contracting, any decision that a business makes involves risk. But implicit bias makes us more comfortable with the in-group risk that we are more familiar with. So whether it's gender, whether it's race, geography, did you go to the same school? We are looking for these points of similarity to help us make decisions, not realizing that they're based in bias. And so another example is when people are making decisions, right? And they use words like fit, professional. What do those words really mean? And so I encourage people to do a series of 5 whys. Why do we need fit for this? Why? And to go through that process. Why? What does fit mean? What does professional? Because that's often coded language that chills bias and racism. So that's another. So in group referrals, it's the language we use. It also requires a new awareness and that we pause before we make decisions, right? So once we become aware that this bias exists, but we may not know when it's happening, how can we design frameworks in our decision making to guard against bias? So Race Forward calls them equity primes or choice points, but it's a framework that you create so when decisions are made across the organization, right, across the enterprise, we go through a series of questions and prompts to see how equity is integrated, embedded, and a part in the lens that we use to make this decision making. To make this decision. The other way that we can do it is an equity impact analysis. What groups are negatively and adversely impacted by our business decisions, right? So we can back map that as well. But implicit bias is insidious and it seeps in very secretive ways. So if we don't create frameworks like primes and choice points and questions for ourselves and take time to pause and notice that, we will continue to do the same thing. And the sad part about implicit bias training, Bob, is that it's shown that it really doesn't change behavior a lot. It changes attitudes, it changes conversation, but to really change behavior, we have to take what we've learned in the training and be very intentional about applying it, right? So the technical solution was the training. Now we need the adaptive solution that really changes our culture. So that would be kind of just a top level view of implicit bias, but know that it is at work in all of us and that because we're not aware of it, we can't course correct if we don't intentionally sit with it and put frameworks in place to help us change the way we do business.
LaTanya, I used to think this was implicit bias was something that could be kind of beaten out of you, with a couple of tough sessions. And now I think we're realizing, no, it's how do we create structures and processes and tools whereby we offset the implicit bias that could otherwise be impacting key business decisions that we're making. And that's a big change from 5 or 10 years ago, if I'm hearing you correctly in what you're saying.
Yeah, precisely.
Ingrid,
I want to weigh in on this.
Ingrid, you may start there, and I'll just ask you one last question, and then we're going to open the floor for questions. I do want to ask you in a similar targeted way, in this current environment, what would be the message you would like to impart on the business community around the issue of supplier diversity practices, now that people are paying maybe a bit more attention to the issue than they had been paying for a while, at least here in Houston? What would be the advice you would give?
Well, I want to start, I'll answer that, but I want to build on a little bit of what LaTanya was saying. I think that there's always this implicit bias when it comes to contracting. And we try to talk to corporations about the decisions that a buyer makes. So a buyer is looking at protecting their job and trying to make the least risky decision when contracting. And so we often find those implicit biases going into those decisions. And so we'll find from a perspective of looking at the criteria for a supplier. And you say, why do they have to have $10 million worth of bonding in order to be able to do this job? Is $5 billion or $5 million or $2 million sufficient? And sometimes the question is just, like I said, unintentional. It's like, well, that's what we've always had in there. But why did we have it in there? So what is our risk if we lower that so that there's broader participation, that there's more companies who are able to qualify and meet the criteria? We've even had companies who we got certified. There's a company that helped BP cap the Macondo well. And it was their technology that they brought to the solution, but they didn't want people to know that they were a minority company because they believed that their customer would then look at them differently if they knew that the company was minority owned versus celebrating that this was a minority owned company or feeling comfortable being able to make that known. So I think that there are these unconscious biases that go into decision making because I always say people do business with people they know, trust, and respect. But if your circle is only those people that look like you, those are the only people that you know, that you gain trust with and respect and feel comfortable doing business. So what we're trying to do is to make those connections so that they get to know other companies, they get to build that trust with those different types of suppliers and begin to utilize them and feel comfortable using them in contracting. So those are some of those unconscious biases that we do see in the process, that we have to ask those why questions. Why do we need this criteria? What value does it bring in terms of our contracting? What do we lose by setting up the criteria in this way? So as we talk about what companies can do going forward, and we look at that, we talk about that minority companies hire more minorities than other non-minority companies. We've done the research, and amongst our members, 3/4 of their employee base are people of color that look like them. And there are people who are employing those people in those diverse communities. So if you're looking to make a longer term impact on minority communities and helping with economic development, self-sufficiency, increasing wealth in those communities, it's by doing business with those minority companies. It's by helping them employ other minority individuals, helping them to provide them with those skills that can help transition those. Many of our entrepreneurs are people who have come from corporate America and who have felt that there's been a bias. They would be more successful utilizing their tools and talents on their own. So how is it that a company that or individual that has made million-dollar decisions on behalf of a major organization is less qualified or seen as having more difficulty doing business with that same company as an entrepreneur than they did when they were making those decisions on behalf of that organization? And so we have to look at things like that and say, what is it that's driving those systemic issues, and how do we make those changes and move those barriers so that we do that? Another example would be BP. One of our board members, who was the chief procurement officer there at one point, had put in place a process in which buyers had to designate if there was a minority, a woman, or a small business included in every single contracting opportunity that they had. And if there was not, they had to list a reason why. And they found significantly that the amount of business and amount of opportunities were provided to minority-owned businesses once they had to begin documenting why they were not included. It made them take a pause, look at their organization, look at the suppliers that they were previously looking at, and seeing how can we add to the supply chain. And what they found is that those businesses that provided that support and who gave those opportunities ended up increasing the amount of spend. So it was I think a eye-opening for them, that once they began to be accountable for why they were not including those businesses in those opportunities, we began to see a change, and we began to see an increase in the amount of business that was given to minority or awarded to minority and women-owned businesses. And it wasn't just because they were a minority or woman-owned business, but they were given an opportunity to compete. And so that's what we talk about, is that we don't want a handout. What we want is a true fair opportunity to compete. Remove those barriers that are artificial, that are biased to those companies who you had already been doing business with. Why are you giving additional points to someone who's a current supplier? Well, then that automatically puts a bias in to keep other suppliers from being able to enter into that supply chain. So we look at things like that that can be done to create more equity and opportunity within the supply chain for minority-owned businesses.
No, thanks, Ingrid. I think those are all great examples of how process changes can really make a substantive difference over time in the outcomes across all these areas. Jenny, I know you're just dying to ask a tough question of the panel. Let's open it up for Jenny in the Q&A.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Bob. And, you know, we've talked a lot about what we are doing within the four walls of a business, right? And then the procurement process and how we can support supplier diversity. but what would you say is the business community's role in addressing equity, racial equity in our broader community? And I'm referencing something that Dwayne Pender, a panelist from last week, had said, where it's, you know, what we're doing in our DEI work and our supply chain diversity, that's all necessary, but not sufficient in addressing racial equity. So, you know, I'd be curious to understand, you know, what do you all see as a collective of the business community in what we should be leaning into in addressing equity much more broadly. And Nicole, I'll start with you. And Bob, you know, you're off the hook as a moderator now, so you can join in as a panelist.
Yeah, absolutely. This is a great question. And another aspect that I think organizational America is just now starting to grapple with and have a conversation about is, how do I extend DEI beyond just what I'm doing internally to what I'm doing in my communities, what I'm doing for with my offerings, and what I'm doing with my customers, and what I'm doing beyond for the world and for our country. So businesses have enormous power politically, financially, and locally to really drive change in outside of their four walls. You can think about it not just in terms of what are you doing for your employees and what does your leadership look like, but what types of offerings are you providing and services, and how might they be disproportionately favoring certain groups of people over others, or being made more accessible to certain groups of people more than others. So, for example, financial services, the financial services industry has a huge role and contribution to how financial loans are decided in terms of who they are allocated toward, valuations of homes, and estate planning services and the accessibility of those types of services. And so what are financial services companies doing to really advance racial equity in the financial literacy and financial planning areas? And that's just one area of society and of life, but the health industry, the professional services industry, all of these industries and areas have a role to play in their local communities, and also on a policy and political level as well. So businesses have enormous power to really influence that change.
Great, thanks, Nicole. LaTanya, same question.
Thank you. I think one thing you often hear from corporations that we have pipeline issues. We can't find the talent. And so connecting your CSR, external affairs, marketing for financial services, CRA, whatever that pot of money is that you use to invest in communities, how can you invest that in a way that builds your pipeline of talent, right? It doesn't mean that community service projects, because I have led a lot of corporate engagements and painted a lot of houses, and doesn't mean that that is bad. We've done a lot of neighborhood cleanups. But justice means we need less charity, right? And so if we can invest in just ways in communities, that would be an option and a way for us to truly make an impact. BIPOC leadership, that when you are looking for nonprofits and organizations within your community to partner with or to support, are you looking at organizations led by Black, Indigenous, people of color? Many of these organizations are on the front line of social movements, doing things that other organizations are not. They're community, they're accountable to communities, but they often don't get supported. They're not on anyone's radar. And often you hear, well, those groups are small. Small doesn't equate to risk. And so look for organizations, regardless of size, that are led by BIPOC leaders, and then open yourselves up to think about funding and partnering smaller organizations. I think lastly, and Nicole was mentioning it, just this theory of targeted universalism by John Powell, which says that because people have different experiences, they are differently situated. So you can't have a universal solution, which I call the efficiency paradox, right? We want something to be efficient, or we want it to be equal. We can't have efficient solutions and equal treatment because people are differently situated because of structural racism. So that means when companies are in communities, they have to have targeted solutions that address the conditions of that community. So invest with specificity.
It's helpful to have kind of these more tangible action points that I know many of our listeners have been listening for in every session. So thank you for articulating a few of those. Ingrid, and then I'll move to Bob afterwards. Any Ingrid thoughts on kind of moving outside of just a business organization, but broadly in the Houston community, what can be done to address equity?
We've looked at how we could and how our business owners could contribute even more to those communities and working with customers. And I think it is making that investment. I think sometimes it's just giving them role models that they could look to that aren't necessarily the sports leaders, but business leaders, people who have started businesses, who are contributing and seeing people that look like them, who are business owners. So we've gone out to high schools and others and supported programs to provide internships. We have a company that started a STEM program where every summer they bring in people of color, children of color, to work in their organization to introduce them to careers in oil and gas early on. Into those areas that they didn't know were even possible or opportunities to do so. So I think that it's reaching down, as LaTanya said, into those organizations, into the structures of the schools, teaching the kids that you can not only work for somebody, but you could be an entrepreneur yourself, and providing them with the technical skills and training to be able to do something similar. So we want to create opportunities. We want to create awareness, open doors and open eyes and ideas to what's possible. I think in many minority communities, sometimes the kids don't know and parents don't know what are the realm of possibilities that are available to me. And so I think it is creating that organization structure where people want to go and work in those organizations. So we want them to know you can go work for a large organization, but you can also have a successful and fulfilling career working in a small business. And so I think it is connecting to those communities, being there, letting them see the work, letting them see the commitment, and the commitment needs to be long-term in order to get the buy-in and the investment in those communities. I think the idea of opportunity zones, providing incentives for businesses to be located into minority communities, helping to grow and flourish those communities. I know the minority community I grew up in here in Northeast Houston no longer has a grocery store anywhere nearby. It has a lot of blight. And I think it's going back and providing opportunities to invest in those communities and locating businesses in those communities so that there's employment there. There's opportunity for growth for them to see the opportunities that they could have.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Ingrid. And Bob, I'm going to add an additional element to yours, just given the role that the partnership plays in representing the business community as a whole. Nicole touched on this, and there was also a question from the audience in terms of policy action, so public policy influence and advocacy as it relates to equity. So in addition to kind of the business community's role in addressing kind of the community issues, let's also add in what can be done on a policy side.
Yeah, when Dwayne Pender with McKinsey made that comment on last week's webinar, it was near the end of the session, and he didn't say a lot, but what he said was very powerful to me, which is when the business community is serious about an issue, they establish clear benchmarks of what they're trying to achieve, and they hold themselves accountable. And if we're serious this time about racial equity and justice, then we should set benchmarks for our communities that go beyond just what we can directly impact as businesses. We should be holding ourselves accountable for how we're shaping or helping shape the community. I mean, LaTanya, you mentioned, painting houses. Companies have CSR objectives that are targeted, and they go out and do things based on that, but they may never ask themselves, did we really move the needle in the community on an issue, even an issue as specific as housing? Did we move the needle? And Dwayne's comment was, businesses, if you're serious, beyond what you can do individually, what you can do collectively is move the needle. So we ought to agree on what those needles are, So for the partnership, we're talking a lot about where can we be most impactful? There are many issues under this heading. We could be talking housing, we could be talking criminal justice, we could talk about health inequities. But I think for the business community and the partnership, it's probably going to be more of a focus on a continuum of education, workforce, talent development, procurement, a kind of a set of issues that are close to what we do and close to what we know and can be impacted. And when we go to those issues, it should be a combination of programmatics and policy. Because again, one of the things the partnership can do and the business community, particularly in Houston, particularly in Texas, is we can wield some of our influence to make some of the policy changes happen that others have probably been calling for, frankly, and we've been kind of deaf to. This is our chance to kind of get on board with those efforts and maybe be at least, something that helps tip the scales in favor of action. But anyway, I think Dwayne's comment is, hey, business community, if you're serious, and if we're serious, we ought to establish what those community objectives are and hold ourselves accountable for moving the needle on those issues.
Thanks, Bob. And so to move it from a very macro level aspirational conversation of big picture thinking and holding ourselves accountable as well, there are these sort of micro relationships, and a lot of the questions that our audience have been asking is how do they navigate those situations. So let's get back inside the four walls again. One of the most, upvoted questions was, how would you suggest addressing the power dynamic that exists within companies with primarily white leadership who invite BIPOC to the table for DEI discussions, but aren't able to see that direct reports are still hesitant in expressing their actual opinions for fear of repercussion, whether actual or perceived. And so, really, Nicole, LaTanya, I feel like that's kind of in your sphere of your space that you work in. So either of you that, I think Nicole.
I think I started, yeah. I think I really love this question, and the reason I love it is that equity, when people think about equity, people don't necessarily think about it in terms of power, but how do we share power equitably, because that is as key to equity as the outcomes and ensuring that people have equivalent or fair access to outcomes. So when we talk about a primarily white leadership team trying to listen to BIPOC employees, which is great, and their BIPOC community, what does it mean for a white leadership team to give up this power sitting at the head of the table and actually sit back and really let BIPOC sort of drive the conversation and have a stake in the decision making? So not to LaTanya's point, not necessarily leaning on them and sort of outsourcing the responsibility to them, but really having them have a share in the decision making. When we think about like shareholding and having a stake in the outcome, how do we ensure that BIPOC are really decision makers in the process and not just contributors or the leaders necessarily?
LaTanya?
Yeah, I think one quick thing that comes to mind is that we have to frame this work not as a favor to, or that we are doing something for BIPOC people, right? We are doing this because it is just, because it is right? Because of the shared humanity frame. And so when we can remove the fact that this is a gift to, or a favor or service that I'm doing for BIPOC, that helps to reframe the conversation and shift that power dynamic. Something simple as how a room is set up. I had a friend who works at a large multinational energy company here in Houston, and manager came in from out of state and said, "You're sitting in my seat." This wasn't in the 80s, this was in the 2000s, and asked this African-American woman to move so he could sit in the same seat, right? So the way rooms are set up, the things that we expect based on what we believe is our role and our privilege, who speaks on the agenda, when they get to speak, the way we structure meetings, do we allow for indigenous practices and storytelling and narrative and other ways of being besides the normative dominant white frame, right? So this looks at more than just, did you get to talk, but how am I sharing power with you because it is right and just to do?
Thank you. And we're running against time. There's a lot of great questions. And so I just want to reemphasize that this is really just the beginning. of conversations and action and discussion. We actually have a series of conversations coming up related to racial equity. Our ERG Summit, October 15 through 16, will continue the conversation, primarily focused on the DEI space. And then we will have Houston Week leading up to the State of the City with Mayor Sylvester Turner, where one of the sessions leading up to his address will focus on racial equity issues. And then also the Policy Summit in early December will have a focus point on looking at policy issues such as education and healthcare and transportation and infrastructure and resiliency with a lens of racial equity and justice. So, you know, really looking at beyond just what we can do within our individual companies and organizations, but much broadly, what can we as a community drive Houston to become a much more inclusive and equitable city, not just the most diverse city in the US. So thank you all for joining us in this series. I am so appreciative of the time that you all have taken, and look forward to taking these conversations into action and really making some impact and change. Thank you to the panelists and to Bob for moderating. I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you. Thanks.
Thanks, Jenny.
Thank you.